Good, good evening, good evening, good evening. Hello, my name is Ian Rowe, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. As part of the Edward and Helen Hintz Book Forum series, I am pleased to welcome you to a discussion of Brad Wilcox's new book, Get Married: Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. A very humble set of objectives. Brad is also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, where he directs the National Marriage Project, and is a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. For more than a decade, Brad has been the leading voice on the indispensable role that marriage and healthy family lives play in virtually every facet of human well-being. In my own work running public charter schools in the Bronx, I have been influenced by Brad's research and that of Ron Haskins and Bell Sawhill, who popularized the data around the success sequence, that 97% of millennials who follow a series of decisions, finishing a high school degree, getting a full-time job, and then if they have children, getting married first, 97% of millennials who follow that order of decision-making avoid poverty. We now teach that concept in our high schools. And it's not just about economics. According to a new report from Institute for Family Studies that Brad just worked on, crime rates are lower among young men in neighborhoods and in cities where stable two-parent families are the norm. Now, Brad is setting his sights even higher on the importance of marriage, both in terms of achieving happiness and saving our civilization. I won't steal his thunder, so first we'll have Brad provide some opening remarks, then we're going to have a fantastic panel with Ramesh Punuru, Emily Jasinski, and Anna Louise Sussman. So with that, we're going to share a video first, but I'd like to share one thought from the preface of Brad's book. Giving ourselves to others, especially spouses and families, is the path most likely to lead to a meaningful and generally happy life for most of us. With that, let's watch a trailer of Brad's book, and then soon you'll hear from Brad Wilcox himself.
Marriage is a game that everyone loses. Men who get hitched set themselves up for financial ruin when the divorce comes. And the ring only shackles women to the home, away from any hopes of professional fulfillment. But what if everything we've heard about marriage is wrong? In his new book, Get Married, sociologist Brad Wilcox counters these cultural narratives, marshaling decades of research to illustrate the simple truth that no group of men and women are happier than those who are married with children.
Media figures can say what they like, but the data clearly show that most marriages do go the distance, and married men and women are much better off than their less attached peers, not just emotionally, but also physically and financially. This leads to stronger communities and ultimately a stronger civilization.
Get married, because the state of our union depends on the state of our unions.
Thank you, Ian, for that gracious introduction. I'm delighted to be here with you all tonight to talk. Start with a few thanks here for So this book project was only possible because of the support of friends and colleagues like Ian here at AEI, at the University of Virginia, and the Institute for Family Studies. At AEI, I'm especially grateful to Robert, to Scott, to Peyton, to Tim, to Mike, and Samantha for making both tonight possible and the book itself possible as well. I'm also thankful to my family, particularly to Danielle, my wife, and I wish you could be here tonight with us. but not even the best babysitter is capable of tri-locating. We've got 3 different practices tonight running down in Charlottesville. But I am thrilled to have another very important woman in my life, my mom here in the back of the room with us tonight. She's lived a heroic life as a single mother and is an inspiration to me on so many fronts, including the literary front, as a recently published author herself. So please join me again in thanking her for raising. So I'm going to start tonight with a request, and that is this. Kind of, if you could just raise your hand if you would like to be happy. Okay, so most of you would like to be happy. Well, a few Sundays ago, I can tell you that I was not particularly happy, and neither was my youngest son, Nicholas. That morning, I had informed Nick that the family was going to be hiking the Monticello Trail, a trail that winds its way up the little mountain where Jefferson's home sits in Charlottesville. Now, because a Sunday hike was not on his agenda, Danielle and I had to endure more than a few eye rolls and a good bit of grumbling before we got Nick and his sisters headed up the trail. Now, I mention this not only because it gives us a window into the peaks and valleys of family life, but also because as a UVA student and professor, over the years, I have learned, lived, taught, and even hiked in the shadow of Thomas Jefferson. He's known for many things, of course, but especially for drafting the Declaration, where he famously underlined the importance of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But this Jeffersonian vision, I think, today is in trouble, okay? It's in trouble. The American experiment is in trouble as well. So what am I talking about here? Well, let's take, for instance, life. What we're seeing across this country of ours is that scores of women and men, especially men, today are turning to drink, to pills, or even the barrel of a gun in record numbers, dying premature deaths of despair. In recent years, suicide, alcohol poisoning, and drug overdoses have killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. This is just but one sign that something is deeply wrong with our civilization. Or consider liberty. I think as it's come to be understood often in America today, it's kind of the freedom to rise from rags to riches, to live that American dream. And here again, I've got some sober news to report about the American dream. What we're seeing, obviously, in the work of the Harvard economist Raj Chetty and his colleagues is that there are too many places, too many communities where the dream is largely beyond the reach of poor children who hail from these communities. In this particular slide, we can see that there are these darker regions on this Chetty figure where too many poor kids tend to remain poor as they move into adulthood. So again, there are places where the geography of upward mobility is not very good. What about the pursuit of happiness, to again use Jefferson's language? When it comes to happiness, what we're seeing is on actually a number of different data sets from Gallup to, in this case, the General Social Survey, that happiness is down in America. The work of the economist Sam Peltzman, for instance, tells us that more and more Americans across this country, millions of Americans, are failing at this kind of most fundamental pursuit, this pursuit of happiness. So what's the biggest factor then, sort of standing in the way of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And if you answer this question kind of on a close reading, what we often tend to see in the media or come across in the academy, you might be forgiven for thinking that perhaps it's economic inequality, or perhaps it's failing schools, or perhaps it's race, or even and especially maybe the current or future occupant of the White House, right? That these are the kinds of things that account for the difficult patterns that we're seeing when it comes to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But I want to suggest tonight, obviously, that no, it's not these things. It's marriage. You know, our most fundamental social institutions in big trouble, and our civilization is paying a big price for our collective inability to forge strong and stable marriages in America today. Now, I'm going to make three kind of different sets of points tonight in my brief remarks. One is to kind of just give you a sense of this closing of the American heart that my new book, Get Married, chronicles. A second thing is to talk kind of briefly about some of the cultural roots that I think are implicated in this American retreat from marriage and family. And then two, to think about the ways in which we need to kind of defy the elites to forge strong families. And I know that there's some skeptics in here on that kind of defy the elites, but I'll try to kind of unpack that notion here tonight. So let's begin kind of by thinking about this closing of the American heart. So what we're seeing obviously is that we're seeing fewer opportunities to kind of give and receive that which is most important, love, across this country. You know, we know that dating is down. We know that fewer Americans are getting married. We know that too many Americans aren't staying married, and fertility keeps falling across America. These are all kind of signs of this closing of the American heart. What we can see here in the slides up on the left and the right is that the marriage rates come down by more than 60% since 1970. What that means in part is that about 1 in 2 American adults are married. This is kind of like a record demographic low in American history, that level. We know that about 1 in 2 kids are being raised outside of an intact married family as well here in the US. It's also kind of an indicator of this family revolution that's been sweeping our country in recent years. And that fertility is falling from almost 4 kids per woman on average in 1960 to about 1.6 kids per woman on average today. And as I've been kind of looking at these demographic trends, I think probably the most striking figure that I've come up with my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang at the Institute for Family Studies, is this next one. And it's showing us kind of this newer pattern for American adults kind of in their prime of life from 18 to 55, one could argue. And what you can see here, if you look at this figure, is that today there are more, in a sense, kinless American adults in their prime who are single and don't have kids than there are American adults in their prime who are married with children. And the term we're kind of getting from China here is bare branches to describe adults who don't have a spouse and don't have kids. Bare branches who are often deeply affected by sort of the winds of social and economic and cultural forces as they kind of move into midlife and as they move into later life as well. And so why are these things important? Well, they're important in part because we're seeing more and more empirical evidence suggesting that this closing of the American heart is deeply implicated in the difficulty that we're having as a civilization in advancing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When it comes to the happiness story, we've got new evidence from the economist Sam Peltzman that sort of the biggest factor, at least kind of mathematically, that explains this drop in happiness in America is the parallel drop that we're seeing in the share of adults who are married in America. Or when it comes to deaths of despair, we have new research from the Gallup economist Jonathan Rothwell that indicates that marriage rates are closely connected to deaths of despair. And in the analyses that he published last week, in terms of the factors that he looked at, marriage was the strongest factor in that analysis. But again, it kind of just gives us some sense of this connection between what's happening in our homes or what's not happening in our homes and the likelihood of, American adults succumbing to things like suicide or a drug overdose. And then, of course, kind of a longstanding concern of AEI is kind of the health and the state and the character of the American dream. And we know from the work of Raj Chetty and his colleagues, again, that family structure is, at least in their 2014 set of analyses, quote, the single strongest correlate of upward mobility for poor kids. Or in lay terms, what we're seeing is that kids who are living in communities with lots of two-parent families, like the Salt Lake City metro area, for instance, are much more likely to kind of move from poverty to affluence as adults. And by contrast, kids who are being raised in communities where there are lots of single parents, places in, like for instance, in the Atlanta metro area, are much more likely to kind of be born poor and to stay poor. It seems in part because they're more likely to be surrounded by lots of families where you don't have that second parent engaged and involved. But what is it about marriage per se? Why is sort of getting married, so important in kind of addressing these challenges, these civilizational challenges? Well, I think we can think about the way in which, as Joseph Heinrich has said at Harvard, marriage, quote, represents the keystone institution for most, though not all, societies, and maybe the most primeval of human institutions. Okay, so what's he getting at with this notion that's kind of a keystone institution? Well, he's getting at, I think, is it the way in which marriage plays a central role in organizing family life, in promoting human flourishing, and maintaining social order. Marriage binds men typically to the children that they father. It stabilizes romantic relationships. It bridges the gender divide between men and women. It endows the lives of women, and especially, I think, men, with a deeper sense of meaning, direction, and solidarity, and provides the ideal context for the bearing and rearing of children. So in simple terms, marriage grounds and guides our most important relationships. And this then is why marriage is our nation's keystone institution. So if marriage is so important, why is marriage in such duress today? Why are its fortunes falling today? And I suggest in the book that part of the story here is that too many of our cultural elites, our journalists, our professors, our C-suite executives, and now our online influencers, the folks who kind of command the heights of our culture, are delivering messages to ordinary Americans that, for instance, privilege mammon over marriage, me before we, and freedom from family rather than freedom, in a sense, for family. We can think, for instance, about the work that's been done by the NYU sociologist Eric Klinenberg on kind of living a soul life. Now, he has a nuanced take on single living and its sort of role in American life, but the clear thrust of his work, for instance, is definitely more laudatory of this kind of move away from marriage and this way sort of move towards singleness. He says, quote, living alone helps us pursue sacred modern values, individual freedom, personal control, and self-realization. They allow us to do what we want, when we want, on our own terms. Okay, so that's kind of just giving you a sense of one, academic perspective on all of this. And we're now seeing, of course, many more kind of left-leaning mainstream journalists also kind of delivering messages that are either implicitly or explicitly more anti-nuptial in character. I'm thinking, for instance, of a recent article in Bloomberg that suggested that kind of marriage and motherhood were sort of more pathways to immiseration rather than prosperity. Now, it actually turns out that this headline here, women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer, is actually false. And I've got a piece coming out this week kind of unpacking that. But the message that was kind of conveyed in this story in Bloomberg was, again, that kind of women who are kind of steering clear of family are not only kind of killing it financially, but they're kind of also killing it emotionally. And that same message was also kind of conveyed and has been conveyed in many other outlets, like this piece by the writer Amy Shern in the New York Times, who said that married heterosexual motherhood in America is a game that no one wins. So again, it's kind of like this idea that marriage and motherhood are kind of leading us towards a path that's more miserable than happy. And these two examples are by no means kind of just outliers in a lot of the contemporary discussions about marriage and family. So I don't think for this audience it's kind of any real big news that there are plenty of left-leaning voices in the academy and in the media who are kind of skeptical or critical or even hostile towards marriage and family. That's kind of in some ways an old story to tell. But I think the newer story to tell in part tonight is that this kind of perspective is now being in some ways strangely mirrored on the online right, okay, the online right. I'm thinking obviously of figures like Andrew Tate, one of the biggest voices in what's called the manosphere. And he has said, quote, "There is zero advantage to marriage in the Western world for men." Okay? So any man in his right mind ought to stay single, make lots of money, play with his toys, Tate's partial obviously to his Bugatti, and use, but not invest in, the opposite sex. Okay? That's kind of Tate's perspective. So when you kind of put these voices together, what you see is that on the left, they're kind of criticizing marriage and family with an eye towards appealing to women. And now on the online right, they're kind of doing the same thing, but with an eye towards appealing to men. But the messaging we're getting from both of these two camps obviously is anti-marriage, anti-nuptial. So again, kind of in the ivory tower to some extent, in the media and online, we're hearing kind of what I call a kind of Midas mindset that's being articulated today. And this Midas mindset tells us that meaning and happiness are to be found in money or in fun or in work and in freedom from the encumbrances of family life rather than in marriage and family. So in other words, we're kind of getting this idea that it's about mammon over marriage today in America. And then when it comes to kind of elite relationship advice, either that's explicit or implicit, we're also kind of getting a very anti-nuptial message, and then we're also kind of being exposed to ideas and behaviors that are not, in my view, very conducive to forging strong and stable marriages. So of course, I really kind of planned my book release better for like this most recent development, this push to advance polyamory. I mean, it's so many media platforms. Now we've got like this new show coming out, Couple to Thruple on Peacock. I mean, wow, So we're getting this message that we should be embracing the sirens that can distract us from investing the attention, the affection, and the money that our spouse deserves, rather than just kind of steer clear from them, all kind of in the name of maximizing choice. It kind of just gives you a sense of where our elites can kind of move when a new idea comes down the pike. Or think about this article in the New Yorker. Okay, it was entitled, quote, "A Sociologist of Religion on Protestants, Porn, and the Purity Industrial Complex." Okay? So what kind of message do you think was conveyed in this New Yorker story about sort of the nexus between faith and family? You want to kind of just guess what this interview told us about how faith and family are connected to one another? What was the story that was told here in the New Yorker? Any guesses out here? Any brave souls want to jump in? What do you think the New Yorker said about this? Really bad, yes. Okay, that's. I mean, okay, it's a little more complex, but that was sort of the gist of it. Do you want to give us a guess here, sir?
I always say it's destructive and it destroys your own personal, what you bring to the table.
Yeah, so this was kind of an article that kind of talked about how, a lot of it's this kind of view, Christian men were kind of porn-addled, basically, and it was sort of fostering a lot of conflict between Christian couples, their handling of pornography, and that Christian wives, were kind of divorcing their husbands. It says conservative Protestant women are twice as likely to divorce their husband because of his pornography use, was, one of the things that was said. But again, the sort of broader point here that was sort of being, I think, implicitly signaled to the reading public was that faith basically is an obstacle to forging a strong and stable marriage. I think that was kind of basically the implicit takeaway to this piece in the New Yorker. Or kind of moving beyond, religion and polyamory, just to talk about something more, pedestrian, and that would be money, okay? And we have been getting, a number of messages, both in the media and then also from financial gurus like Susie Orman, that are kind of suggesting to us that we should take a kind of a me-first approach to money, have his money over here and her money over there, because we want to foster autonomy in marriage, okay? So I'm just kind of giving you a flavor of some of the elite messaging, around marriage, that's sort of trying to encourage us to kind of move in a more me-first direction, to walk away from the retrograde faith of our forebears, and to kind of keep our sexual and relational options open. Okay, that's what we're kind of, getting. And how does this all work out? We'll come back to that question in a few minutes here. But before we kind of just talk about the messaging, I also want to acknowledge, I think sometimes conservatives will kind of gesture towards culture. The problem is culture, right? Sort of this vague thing that's sort of floating out there, these ideas, these aspirations, these ideals, these norms, without kind of really grappling with the way in which, the economy and corporate America can be advancing cultural patterns, cultural vices that are hurting a lot of Americans. And so I'm thinking, right, of what's been called by some electronic opiates, and the way in which some of our nation's biggest corporations now in America are profiting from products that undercut the values and virtues that are needed for love and marriage, right? So I'm thinking about, the ways in which, for instance, we've got growing evidence that these electronic opiates are robbing too many of our teenage boys and young men of the drive to succeed in school and at work, and also leaving too many of their female peers anxious and depressed, okay? And now we're also learning of the ways in which big tech products are fueling ideological polarization between young men, kind of pushing them to the right, for the audience here, and pushing young women to the left. And Lyman Stone and I have written about this, for The Atlantic, kind of the way in which there's growing ideological polarization, which is just one more factor making it more difficult for people to get together. And again, another factor that's kind of making this closing of the American heart unfold across our society, okay? So hopefully now you're getting some sense of why it is that I said, in my title that we should be defying the elites, recognizing, acknowledging, actually also in my book, that our elites are often doing pretty well in their own personal lives when it comes to marriage and family, but they're often articulating ideas and behaviors, and they're sort of sitting behind or sitting in C-suite, offices that end up, undercutting the strength and stability of American families. But let me be a little bit more concrete about kind of why it makes sense to defy the elites and defy some of the cultural norms and ideas and messages and memes that are kind of running through our culture today. So when it comes to happiness, what we know actually from research that I've done with Wendy Wang and others have done, looking at the general social survey, is that yes, things like education, things like money, things like work are linked to greater happiness for Americans. But this notion that they are kind of like the be-all and the end-all, kind of the source and summit of our lives, seems off the mark. Because simply being married is linked to more reports of happiness with one's life in the GSS than things like money or college education or even being employed. And there is no factor, there's no variable in the data set in GSS that's as powerful as predicting global happiness as a good marriage. Again, not money, not work, not sexual frequency, not self-rated health, not even regular religious attendance. So I think we need to kind of understand and appreciate that kind of this most fundamental relationship and the sort of the quality of that relationship is pretty darn important in predicting happiness for ordinary Americans today. Then when it comes to kind of just thinking about claims made by writers like Amy Sherman in the New York Times that sort of paint a very kind of negative portrait of the role of marriage and motherhood, for instance, or you could think too about Andrew Tate and his comments about marriage for men, right? What we see in the data is that there's no group of women, for instance, that are happier in that 18 to 55 group, especially the 35 to 55 group, than married moms. And there's no group of women who are more likely to be in sort of the lowest category in the GSS, which is, quote, not too happy, that's the red category, than women who are single and childless. So again, these statistics tend to run against a lot of the mainstream media narratives, at least I've been reading, in recent years. And it's much the same story that we see in the GSS for men. Again, contra kind of the messaging from someone like Andrew Tate on the online right. Great timing. Okay, what about this sort of this push to kind of open up marriages, to kind of minimize fidelity, those classic vows, forsaking others, all that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, we actually are seeing, in the GSS, in Pew data, that more and more Americans, particularly younger adults, like many of the folks here tonight, are a lot softer in their views about this question, or obviously about this issue of polyamory or opening up your marriage. But we actually see is kind of in the real world that couples who kind of embrace the more classic norm, this idea that infidelity is always wrong, are more happy in their marriages, okay? So there's still kind of a strong link between embracing commitment and flourishing in your marriage. Or what about religious community? Well, contra kind of the implicit message in the New Yorker, what we see is that on average, both men and women who are religious, including the evangelicals that were sort of spotlighted in the New Yorker piece, are on average more likely to be flourishing in their marriages, and on average, less likely to end up in divorce courts. We've got here evidence from Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard, just looking at trends for women, actually, a large sample of women in the United States, and what we can see here in purple is that women who are regularly attending religious services are about 45% less likely over the course of this data set to be ending up in divorce court. And there's other evidence, too, that kind of comes to similar conclusions. So again, for ordinary people, religion tends to be a force for stronger marriages and not for weaker marriages. And what about cash? Well, again, contra Susie's advice, we see here is that Americans who are pooling their money, couples who are pooling their money are more likely to be happy compared to those who have separate accounts. They're also less likely to be divorce prone. And there are probably a number of folks here who have some kind of social science training. And you're thinking to yourself, well, this is just a selection effect, right? The kinds of people who combine their checking accounts are just different in ways from the kinds of people who have separate accounts. And it's these underlying differences, not kind of how you organize your money, that would explain a pattern like the one up on the screen. But we actually have really cool new evidence from some scholars at Indiana University and Northwestern and some other places where they randomly assigned newlyweds, okay, to separate accounts, to joint accounts, and to kind of do whatever they pleased. And they found that the couples who were randomly assigned to joint accounts did markedly better in the first 2 years of marriage. There was declines in happiness for everyone. The honeymoon effect kind of dissipated to some extent. But the declines were much larger for couples who were randomly assigned to separate accounts. It kind of gives us some pretty strong evidence that there's something really here in terms of fostering more of a me before me approach to money. And then finally, I touched on the tech issue. We could spend probably the entire night talking about technology and American family life, but I'm just going to give you one figure from my colleagues, Wendy Wang and Michael Toscano, kind of just looking at a new YouGov survey and just sort of basically showing that couples who are using tech less often are more likely to be in that very happy category for marital happiness. Okay, so John, it just gives you a sense of the way in which couples who are managing to kind of keep tech at bay from their relationships and hopefully too from their teens to some extent are more likely to be flourishing in today's America. Now, if the kind of argument that I've been making still leaves you kind of, skeptical, I think it's also kind of just worth thinking about the way in which so many of our elites are doing in their own private lives exactly the opposite of what they're kind of standing for oftentimes in their public lives, okay? I see this with professors And I see this obviously with Hollywood moguls as well. And I'm thinking here, right, of Reed Hastings, the co-founder of Netflix, who has a network that's not always all that family friendly. I mean, it depends on the show, obviously. But in particular, I'm thinking of the movie Marriage Story, right, that was produced by Netflix. And this movie presents a very kind of dystopian portrait of marriage in America. Okay, not actually even acknowledging that we've actually seen divorce come down for the kinds of educated elites that are profiled again in Marriage Story. But of course, the irony here is that in his autobiography, Reed Hastings talks about how he and his wife struggled early on in marriage with some work-family issues. But they went to counseling and they were able to kind of reconcile and work through these issues. And they've now been married more than 3 decades with 2 kids, okay? So again, you've got someone who in his own kind of private life seems to be living a kind of marriage-minded, stable family life, and yet kind of is presiding over a critically acclaimed movie that's sort of painting a very different portrait of marriage in America today. So it just kind of gives you, I think, some sense of how we should probably watch what our elites are doing, right, more than what they are saying when it comes to marriage and family in America. Okay, so what do we do with all of this in terms of how do we kind of go forward when it comes to renewing the American experiment, when it comes to reopening the American heart? As we kind of think about this question, I'm keenly aware of the ways in which there are plenty of folks within probably about 10 miles of here who would be very skeptical, right? We're not going to get anything done here when it comes to reviving marriage and family in America. The government, public policy, the media, the schools, the churches, they can't really do anything to reopen the American heart, okay? To turn things in a better direction. But I'm going to ask you just sort of 2 more questions before kind of wrapping things up here to kind of push back at the naysayers, okay? And the first question is, what do you think is the biggest federal agency? And I actually can see one employee from that agency in the back of this room who is a friend. Reagan, what's the biggest federal agency in America? No, you, yeah. The military, right? Okay. And why do you think, I'm just going to bother you once more, Reagan. Sorry to put you on the spot here. But why do you think, as a member of armed services, the Army, why do you think I'm mentioning this right now at this juncture in my talk? Any ideas about where we're headed here? Its ability to influence. Influence what?
Well, there's incredible benefits that are granted to people who are married. Pay increases for having dependents, for housing rates, and whatnot.
Exactly. Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot, but you were just like, I'm looking at this question like, oh, I've got a member of the Army right there. This is great. So anyways, the point here simply, right, is that, again, a lot of people, including journalists in recent podcasts in the New York Times, expressing kind of the view we can't really do much with policy to kind of strengthen and stabilize marriage in America, right? And yet when you look at the military, what you see in research by Jennifer Lundquist, sociologist, UMass Amherst, and others, is that kind of through a variety of different ways, good benefits, maybe a more, in some ways, marriage-friendly culture, at least for the folks who've got families, on bases, and then policies that prioritize married families and don't extend benefits to cohabiting couples. There is much higher levels of marriage in the U.S. military than there is in the larger civilian population, okay? And we also see that in particular, oftentimes, like trends for working class Americans in the military and African Americans in the military are much more, in a sense, marriage friendly than they are in the larger population. Now, again, I think we can wonder about selection effects here, and I'm happy to acknowledge that there's a selection, effect story here in part. But these are pretty striking differences that we see here when it comes, and this is actually based upon some recent work that Michael Pugh and I have done with the General Social Survey, just kind of giving you a sense of the descriptive trends today that are pretty striking. So again, we're seeing that folks who don't have a college degree, and have some connection to the military, much more likely to be married. African Americans are much more likely to be married if they've served in the military, and then whites as well in this table. So it kind of just gives a sense that when you actually kind of prioritize marriage, in this case, in this form of federal policy, you can see some real results. And if we kind of took a more kind of assertive posture towards marriage, in other parts of the federal government might see some similar results as well. So again, on the governmental front, I think we should be doing things like eliminating marriage penalties that affect too many working class families. We should be tackling big tech and its deleterious role in American family life. And then also thinking about kind of advancing the cultural value of marriage family with the success sequence, which Ian talked about earlier tonight, both in public schools, but also in public campaigns across the US as well. But obviously, particularly here at AI, we're thinking too not just about the state, but also civil society. And in my book, I talk about ways in which churches and other nonprofits could do more when it comes to family ministry, how private schools could do more when it comes to family life education, and how both religious and secular nonprofits could be more kind of outspoken and more creative in social media. And I'm happy to see here tonight the head of Communio, who's doing a great job in working with Protestant and Catholic churches on this score across the US, JP DeGance. And then also happy to talk to you about the National Marriage Week and their work to kind of promote marriage at this time of the year in communities across America. And then when it comes to the media, I think there's also kind of a big role for the media to play in all of this, to kind of turning us in a better direction. And I'm not asking for journalists to kind of paint some kind of rose-colored portrait or some kind of rose-colored view about what's happening when it comes to family, just to kind of tell the truth, right? Just tell the truth, okay? That's what I'm asking for tonight. And I'm happy to acknowledge that there are journalists who really do their best on this score. People like David Leonhardt, whose quote kind of gives you a sense of his perspective on the topic that we're discussing. We need to keep more people kind of have this kind of commitment to kind of telling the truth about marriage and family stability when it comes to the welfare of not just kids, but also adults and communities and then the country at large. Now, in all of this, it's clearly the case that courage is required to kind of push our culture, to push our polity, to push our economy in a more marriage-friendly, family-friendly direction. But let me close on a more kind of personal note for this audience here tonight. So speaking of courage, I think it's kind of, we got to be honest, here. From my perspective, there's a kind of demographic tsunami that's coming at our young adults, that I've articulated tonight. We're kind of projecting that 1 in 3 young adults today will never marry, probably at least, and 1 in 4 will never have kids. And these are kind of unprecedented trends, okay? So in the light of these kinds of demographic and relational and family dynamics that are kind of coming down the pike, courage is required not just on Capitol Hill or in corporate America, but also when it comes to dating, okay? And believe me, I understand that it can be hard out there when it comes to dating. But consider the story of our fearless former leader here at the American Enterprise Institute, Arthur Brooks, okay? He said this about his own dating experience back in the day. He says, "She was 25, I was 24. We spent only a couple of days together and shared no language in common. But when I returned to the United States from that European music festival, I announced to my parents that I had met my future wife. Of course, I had to convince Esther first. So I tackled the project as if it were a startup. I began by studying Spanish. Before long, I quit my job and moved to her native Barcelona, where I knew no one except her, in hot pursuit. The market pressure was intense. Men would shout wedding proposals to her from moving cars. But I pressed on, undeterred. It took 2 years to close the deal, but she finally said yes, and we married." So Arthur's story here underlines the value of courage, or the virtue of courage, of making that first move. And he's been happily married for more than 30 years. Esther, of course, was also courageous to give someone she initially wasn't sure about a chance at earning her affections and her love. And Arthur's story reminds me a little bit of my own story. Danielle and I had our first date on, of all days, April Fool's Day a few years ago at Mr. Jefferson's University. But unlike Arthur and Esther, we didn't have to navigate a language barrier. We had to navigate some ideological and religious differences in our 20s. I think probably as many of you might have to as well. Nevertheless, I'm happy to report that we've been now married more than 28 years. And among the most important fruits of our marriage are our own children, including Nick, the son that I mentioned at the beginning tonight. And speaking of Nick, one day, as I was driving my kids to school, practically in the shadow of Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, I sent Danielle a voice-to-text message on some kind of pedestrian. Probably it was travel sports. And I'm sorry, Tim, to confess my kids' involvement in travel sports. But before I could finish this message to Danielle, okay, Nick piped up from the back seat and said, "I love you, I love you, I love you." It was caught on the text. And of course, my wife knew instantly that this was from Nick because he's such a big fan of hers. And so on that cool spring morning last year, Danielle got to start her workday on an especially happy one, okay? So stories like this are what it's all about, right? Help us to understand how much marriage and family afford us so many opportunities to give and receive that which is most important, love. And they show us that if we wish to revive that most classically American pursuit, what Jefferson called, quote, the pursuit of happiness, we need to do a better job when it comes to opening our hearts to marriage for the sake of our kids, ourselves, and our civilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. That was amazing. I feel compelled to share that my parents, Vincent and Eula, were married for 48 years, and the foundation of everything that I've been able to achieve in my life. Well, now, why don't we have our three respondents come up. Ramesh Panuru. Where's Ramesh? There he is. Ramesh, contributing columnist for the Washington Post, an editor of the National Review, and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Emily Jasinski, there she is, culture editor at The Federalist and host of Federalist Radio Hour. And then last but not least, Anna Louise Sussman, a freelance journalist who writes about gender, economics, and reproduction. And she's currently working on her first book, Inconceivable: Reproduction in an Age of Uncertainty. So, Ramesh, why don't you start us off, your initial comments and response, and then we'll go to Emily and Anna Louise.
I thought this was a terrific book, and I'm going to tell you my favorite chapter comes early in the book. It's called Masters of Marriage. It's about groups who tend to do better at marriage, having stable and successful marriages. The faithful, religiously faithful, Asian Americans, conservatives and college-educated people. And as I'm reading this, I'm realizing that's why I'm invited to this panel. Check, 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 check. So I'm a master of marriage, it turns out. I am going to report on this to my wife. I think it's going to be a very pleasant surprise for her. I might have to get the highlighter out and some sticky notes on some of those pages. It's a very readable guide through a lot of social science literature that ends up confirming wisdom that would not have been foreign to a lot of our great-grandmothers. But it is nice to see that confirmation nonetheless. I think that Brad puts a lot of emphasis on bad cultural messages that are, I think, indeed harmful to people and that have been propagated quite widely. The idea, as in particular, that marriage is bad for your happiness, which is in a way a kind of subset of the idea that the way to pursue happiness is to pursue happiness, which is a great error. I do think that the emphasis on economics that comes fairly late in the book is in a way a little bit understated. And I say that as somebody who's broadly sympathetic to the kind of public policy agenda that Brad sketches at the very end there. But I think we do also have to understand that in an age as prosperous as ours is, single parenthood is just going to be more economically viable than it was 100 years ago, and so you're going to have more of it. Doesn't mean there's nothing government can do, but it does mean yes, there is a limit to what even the best public policy can achieve on that front. Similarly, when in an age when the opportunity cost of having additional children has risen for a lot of different reasons, you are going to have a decline in the number of children. Again, I'm a big supporter of a lot of the policy ideas that Brad talks about, in particular the expansion of the child tax credit. But we should also keep in mind that these are not small economic factors that we're talking about, and that some of these cultural messages have attained their currency in part because of the economic changes that we've seen. Two other things I would note. This does come up in the book, but I think it might deserve a little bit more attention, and that is the extent to which some of what we are seeing that we deplore, as those of us particularly who are social conservatives, as Brad and I are, is a result of social conservatives having succeeded in our own kind of cultural messaging. I think we were pretty successful in some ways at spreading the fear of divorce. And one of the effects of that extreme fear of divorce now is that people aren't getting married in the first place. One of the sort of foils in the book throughout its length is Stephanie Coontz, who's this great progressive scholar of family life. And her argument is that the fragility of modern marriage and families is related to the happiness, the intensity of modern marriage and family. And I think Brad scores some important points against that view, but I do think that there is something that is left undisturbed in that body of scholarship, and it may be that one of the key ways we got the divorce rate so far down is that we've persuaded a lot of people just not to get married in the first place.
Emily?
Well, I'll just actually pick up on that point Ramesh just made, because if you also look at surveys and you look at why millennials say they haven't gotten married, one of the answers is, and this is a point that Brad raised repeatedly, is it's a very materialist answer. And people cite student loan debt as one of the biggest reasons they don't get married. Now, this isn't an argument in favor of forgiving student loan debt so much as it's an argument for understanding that we have completely changed the way people see marriage. So there's this strange idea that you're materially better off, and for some of the reasons that Ramesh just listed, there's some very legitimate arguments for ways that people can be materially better off if they make X, Y, and Z decisions in their life, as Andrew Tate loves to talk about. But at the end of the day, when you add it all up and you look at and actually I think one of the best services Brad does with this book is compiling the research and putting it in one place. And when you look at that, obviously marriage really is the bedrock to self-fulfillment and even those sort of materially positive benefits. So that argument isn't even correct, that to have material success in life, because if you're divorced from any religious tradition and you see the sort of path to fulfillment as being intertwined with material success, if you look at it that way, not even that argument is correct. And that's the argument that we're really being deluged by. And one of the other great services Brad does in this book is just compiling some spectacular headlines. If you haven't read the book yet, we just saw some of them on the video, but it's worth reading the book just to look at some of this media coverage in and of itself. Just from the preface, he pulls from The Atlantic, The Case Against Marriage, Time, Having It All Without Having Children, The New York Times, Divorce Can Be an Act of Radical Self-Love, And the amount of coverage of quote unquote self-love that I think Brad aptly and directly ties to the trends in marriage, it goes back exactly to what we were just talking about, people's conception of what marriage is for, why you should get married. If it's just about self-love, the institution of marriage in and of itself is going to seem outmoded. If it's just about, if it's just something you can do when you're already financially stable and well off, again, marriage itself is going to seem like an outmoded institution to enter into. It's going to seem obsolete if that's how you conceptualize marriage. And it really is the message that you're getting culturally over and over and over again. And another thing I just wanted to note that is it's a service from Brad. He talks about how, picking up on the work of Nick Eberstadt, men in particular, men without work, right, as Nick wrote about. That is also something you see over and over again in the media, covered poorly. And Charles Murray, one of the first things we do at the National Journalism Center is have our kids on day one take the bubble quiz. Has everyone here taken the bubble quiz? The bubble quiz will blow your mind if you haven't taken it. It's a little outdated now. It's from like 2016, so some of the cultural references, if you're younger, might not seem super relevant anymore. But we take it at NJC on day one, specifically because the students find time and again, it opens up their mind as to how we filter our experiences through these different cultural touchstones. And the Reed Hastings example that Brad gave is fascinating. Partially also because Marriage Story was written by Noah Baumbach, who is married to Greta Gerwig. So it's as Tim, who's in the audience, writes about in Alienated America, he calls it the Lena Dunham fallacy. And I think, Tim, I have your definition here. You talk about how it's the tendency to attribute to elites. You could even correct me if I'm wrong, but the tendency to attribute to elites trends of cultural decadence, basically, that we typically attribute to the working class, when in fact it is, I think maybe I mixed that up, but Tim, you can go ask Tim about it, buy Tim's book. But the point is that you have the Lena Dunhams of the world denigrating the institutions, the traditionalist institutions, while actually in their own lives kind of embracing our perception of them is that they don't live those lives, but actually they do live those lives disproportionately, and Brad writes about that in the book. And so that's how you end up being deluged by coverage in the media and in Hollywood over and over again that denigrates this institution that they themselves are entering into, and that they themselves are benefiting from disproportionately. It's sort of like this confirmation bias ignorance. You don't realize that this is confirmation bias because it is at this point so baked into our culture. And again, this is just a really, really important two dots that are connected in Brad's book. To his point, the class and marriage conversation is not new, but I think if you read this book and you see how downstream, I mean, I'm 30. I really grew up in this culture. And I think if you talk to some of the people that are even younger than me here, they will tell you that it's even more acute for them, that it has been more acute for them. And I do think sometimes people who didn't grow up in that sort of post-marriage culture, I think people miss how profoundly that has affected the worldview of people who did grow up in that culture, to the point where, once again, student loans are seen as an obstacle to entering into a marriage. That fundamental idea of what marriage was for, what it should be, has been so battered that it's basically unrecognizable to people my age and younger. So again, that is one of my biggest takeaways from the book is how deeply people have been influenced by this cultural signaling that comes to us from people who are not engaged in sort of some grand Marxist conspiracy, but actually just haven't paused, looked around themselves in their own communities, and internalized the sort of success sequence that defines the cultures that they live in.
Thank you.
Thank
Anna.
you. Brad, thank you so much for the chance to be part of this conversation, and congratulations on your book. And I could not agree more that there is too much loneliness today, that people would benefit from more companionship, from opening their hearts and being more emotionally vulnerable. And I love that idea of a we first versus a me first attitude that you identify as being an important component of a successful marriage. And I would argue it's an important quality to bring to all of our relationships, friendships, and even just when we're in shared public spaces, where I think, people are very me first. There are a few things that struck me while reading the book. I guess I wasn't that convinced that the elite narrative is anti-marriage. You can pick any mainstream media publication and find anti-marriage sentiment or pro-marriage sentiment. So your own website says that your work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, National Review Online, NPR, NBC's The Today Show, and many other media outlets. Your message and that of other marriage advocates such as Melissa Kearney, who has another book on this topic. In my perception, they are getting covered in the media, in all of those outlets and more. Like Washington Post had multiple, columns on her book that I remember. And then in popular culture, one of the most classic movie genres is the rom-com, in which people meet and fall in love, and then some hijinks ensue, and then they get married at the end. So all of this pro-marriage cultural sentiment that I perceive is reflected in the fact that a lot of people still do want to get married. So again, this is from a New York Times column that came out a week or two ago by Jess Gross. She noted that in 2020, 71% of high school seniors reported that they expected to marry in the future. And that was 69% of men and 76% of women. So there's a little gender asymmetry there, which is interesting. But to your point, this proportion is down from a high of 81% in 2006. And I can't remember the exact intervals. I think there was also a 2014 data point or something in between. So I'd be curious if you have thoughts on what shifted or what's happened since then. The choice that you made to profile these 4 groups that are good at marriage was also interesting because 2 of those groups are characterized by really severe gender imbalances. So as you've said, you and Lyman have written about how conservatives tilt more male. There's not enough kind of conservative women for conservative men. And the strivers who you proxy by college education tilt heavily female, and that's also a trend that I think is, just increasing in the future. Then of the other 2 groups, the faithful, just demographically is, a shrinking group with more people reporting that they don't have a religious practice or identification. And Asian Americans is not a group that you can just join. So even if these groups are good at marriage, especially for the first 2, how would you get more of them to marry if we presume some degree of homogamy of people wanting to marry people like them, and there's that sizable gender mismatch. And then in my reporting, because I write about some of these issues, when I interview people or when I hear from readers who, after I publish something, I see, unfortunately, and this is really, I just find this really heartbreaking, like a lot of mistrust between women and men. Your colleague, Dan Cox, is here tonight, has done a lot of surveys where this shows up in the data. He's identified a growing gap in values and shared experience, even just lived experience or online experience between young women and men, like especially younger people. And then there was recently, people may have seen a chart from a series of charts from the Financial Times, a whole column about how this is a global phenomenon. It's you see it in a lot of other countries. I first noticed it in Poland in 2019 when I was there doing some reporting, and some polling data came out about men voting for a very hard right party and women voting for Greens and left-wing party. South Korea, we've historically had a gender gap here in the US in terms of our politics. What I hear from men is that they feel women want to take advantage of them financially. They feel overlooked in a dating market, especially literally overlooked if they're a short stature. They complain about that. And you have something on that like women want a big man, but if you look at the distribution of the height curve, there's like not everyone, is 6 feet. Like most, some share of men are not. So, where does that leave people like that? There's also this idea that boys are getting shafted at school and at university, that marriage laws, I hear this a lot from men. Of course I don't get married, I'm just gonna get hosed in a divorce, so like, why would I do something like that? And I'm not sure where all these messages are coming from, but people are definitely absorbing them and telling me about it at least. And then I hear from a lot of women who they are actively dating. If we go back to that slightly higher expectation of women who expect to get married, they are dating. I think there's still a lot of cultural pressure on women to get married and have kids, so they internalize that. And also, as you said, a lot of people I think it's very human to want companionship. Women are socialized to be more relational. I think, that it's very natural to want to find someone to spend time with and to love. But what I hear from them is that they find men underwhelming and not emotionally available or commitment oriented. So it doesn't surprise me that you saw a lot of unmarried, childless women, especially if something that they would like to change those two statuses, that they report not being happy because they're seeking that and not finding it. And then I think, there's something kind of ahistorical about the book, I would say, in terms of how different groups' family lives have been treated in American history. So like, Black family life has historically been devalued. Black families are torn apart, and to use Dorothy Roberts' words, by the welfare system. That's like not even going further back in history, but I think things like that, the fact that queer folks were people actively, again, fought to keep them from marrying. I think we have to look also at the sort of selectivity of this pro-marriage message. And, then I guess my main issue, I would also say, is with this kind of pro-marriage, marriage at all costs idea, is that it's not coming from the left necessarily, or like that I don't think it's great policy. It's more from my ideological commitments as a hopeless romantic. Like, I think relationships are already too transactional. You mentioned the student loan debt, thinking of yourself as sort of your net worth. But you have this idea of staying in a relationship because it's good for the kids. Even if or that there's an economic. You have I think like a Korean American woman who talks about this isn't really about love or romance. It's like setting a good foundation for our kids. And in my experience, kids pick up on when their parents are unhappily married. It doesn't model for them a healthy, loving relationship. Kids don't necessarily feel good at home when they see that one or both of their parents is unhappy or isn't being respected or valued by the other parent. So again, I think it's deeply human to want companionship and compatibility in a serious partnership and not just kind of function as an economic unit. And unfortunately, for reasons that you've shown, this meaningful companionship is harder to find these days because there's negative messaging, gender divide. So I guess it doesn't feel helpful to me to just tell people get married, or that if they're not married, they're somehow harming their kids, because it's simply not that easy to do as far as I can tell. By contrast, I think if you're talking about policy, there are more targeted, effective policy options. Like if you're interested in targeting child poverty or helping people earn a living wage, you can do that. To me, it's much more straightforward than trying to conjure love and marriage on a mass scale. So I'll end with a few questions. I don't see that marriage has revealed itself to be amenable to policy interventions. Like, you gave the example of the military. So the military is an employer. So how does that translate in terms of like, would you have corporations, if you work at AEI, should AEI extend like gigantic spousal benefits? Or would you have the government extend similar benefits to the entire population? Like, how does that translate? Or do you think that, are there other, because a lot of those marriage programs, I think Melissa Kearney went through a lot of them in her book and said they haven't worked. So I'm curious, where that takes us. For women, I think if they can't find a person whose company they enjoy and who's caring and respectful, can you articulate more precisely, like, what is the benefit of marriage per se to someone like that. If she's financially independent, she's not meeting someone who she likes to just like go on a hike with or go to dinner with. What is it about marriage exactly that brings these benefits, like just entering into a union or being part of this institution? Or for someone who doesn't think that it's a, a sacrament, it doesn't have that like same faith-based motivation. Yeah, maybe you can put a finer point on what it is about marriage exactly that brings these benefits. And then I was curious for the audience members, especially the younger people, if you want to get married and why or why not. Thank you.
We're actually almost out of time, but Brad, I want to invite you back up. And I thought I'd just ask one question, because one of the things that's so striking about this whole discussion is that marriage generally is continuing to thrive amongst the quote-unquote elite, amongst the upper middle class. I run schools in the Bronx where the non-marital birth rate is 84%, right? So not only is marriage not the norm, but what is normal is having children outside of marriage. And with the concept of multiple partner fertility, multiple children without marriage. And yet the data that Brad lays out in the book is so compelling. Educational outcomes for kids, likelihood of criminal activity, health outcomes, poverty. Even Raj Chetty, I mean, certainly, his own studies, family structure was the biggest factor in predicting poor kids' odds of realizing the American dream in communities across the country. And yet, there seems to be this hesitancy of social scientists just to be honest about that simple fact. Because if you don't believe that family structure is at the core of likely outcomes and you move to all these other causalities, structural bias, economic inequality, you come up with wholly different sets of interventions. Well, first of all, why do you think that that's the case? Why do you think in the face of such compelling data, especially for low-income populations, not the elite, not the single moms who have the luxury of making choices where they can, account for some of these things, but in populations where this is a real issue?
But if it's not an issue for single moms who have resources, like if their kids come out fine, then why is marriage the variable?
Right, so I guess the question is, do you believe the data or is it just correlational versus causal, that family structure seems to be at the heart of such dramatic differences? And I see it every day in the schools that I lead. Because again, if you start with that's actually not a thing, then yeah, you can go down a very different path.
I mean, like you said, for single women, for example, who do this by choice, who have resources or who have extended family support, and their kids seem to do fine, or if it's not about, for example, heterosexual marriage and families who have kids who grow up in queer households, with two parents, also really thrive. I mean, I guess I'm not totally convinced that it's not a function of resources and the parents' education and like the neighborhood stuff. I mean, to me, I don't think we've fully teased out those things. Like, the neighborhoods you're talking about are disadvantaged on a number of other axes. I'm from New York, like, South Bronx has the whole history, and I'm not sure that the family structure is the only variable. I mean, it may be a really key one, but, we're talking about kids facing multiple challenges.
Yeah, no, what's interesting, and definitely for the others to weigh in, the Raj Chetty research I think is so interesting, like the map that Brad shows, shows this map across the country, which basically, what's the likelihood of a child being born in the lowest economic quintile, ending up in the top, and there are vast differences, which suggests that federal policy or national policy is not actually the biggest intervention. There are much more local factors, and what his analysis indicates, family structure, religious faith.
Well, I suspect that one of the things that's going on here is that people don't want to send the false and harmful message that if your parents aren't married, if you get divorced, if you never find somebody and get married, that's it, that you're doomed. If you've had kids out of wedlock, they're going to be criminals, and they're,
Right.
and that's a legitimate thing to be concerned about.
Yep.
That's not a reason for neglecting to lay out things that do make a difference in people's happiness and in children's thriving. But I think that's always been one reason for that kind of reticence.
Can I ask another question?
So can I maybe just answer one comment quickly, and then I think we can go to 7 o'clock, right? And maybe give the audience a little bit of a chance to jump in here too. But so I think, the challenge that you posed, Anna, about like, well, is it really kind of a good thing to kind of promote marriage? So you've got the title Get Married in a context where I think actually you and I both agree on a lot of the challenges facing young adults. From ideological polarization, which you touched on, to the ways in which men in some important respects are floundering, on and on and on. So I think you and I both would project a lot of non-marriage for young adults today. And so in the face of that reality, what I'm sort of saying basically is like, look, I'm trying to basically encourage folks to avoid a fate that's going to be falling upon a lot of them and their peers, to be more kind of strategic and engaged. And what I see at UVA, for instance, is that so many students are told by their parents, their professors, the culture, that it's all about education, work, and money. And Pew, data kind of confirms that. And they need to be kind of breaking away from that Midas mindset to understand that, no, in fact, it's not about those things. Those things are important, yes, but it's really about love and friendship and family. And if you prioritize those things, you're probably going to approach UVA a lot more, a lot differently than you would otherwise. You're going to approach your work experience, your religious or your secular civic communities differently. So I'm just trying to basically get people to realize, look, there's some bad stuff coming down the pike. And if you want to have a shot at, not a guaranteed shot at, but a shot at what I view as probably the most important thing for most of us, a spouse, kids, a reasonably happy family life, then you've got to start making choices now to avoid this demographic tsunami kind of coming down, the pike. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. But I think in terms of the diagnosis, we're pretty much aligned. But did you want to sort of jump in, Emily, and say something quickly?
I was just going to say there's an important point there also, because you write in your book about the deluge of headlines related to self-love. And so if you're combining, there's a tension that I think some people don't even necessarily recognize, that might be professors, that might be journalists, between saying that part of self-love is the pursuit of these material outcomes, is the pursuit of a successful career, it's the pursuit of wealth, it's the pursuit of those different things. How does that sort of fit into this context of self-love being a primary route towards happiness? And that is a huge problem that I think is really hard to explain. And one of the most powerful variables that Brad tackles in the book, the outcome of happiness and fulfillment, which you have data that, marriage is more powerful towards that. You had the GSS data that marriage is more powerful on that than income, than education, than all of these different variables. That, to me, is striking as the most powerful evidence in favor of marriage itself as the institution that promotes, perhaps the most important outcome, which is, at the end of the day, are people feeling fulfilled in their lives.
Or their children
Right.
have the best opportunity.
I did love that op-ed title, that divorce can be a radical act of self-love. Yeah, yeah, we know that.
But, it depends. Is it a conscious uncoupling? Is it a divorce? These things matter.
All right.
So questions from the audience? I'm sure that there are a lot of them. Yes, sir. Just come around.
So, Brad, as a follow-up to this, would you write about just commitment to something in general? If you can't get married, how about
Sure.
just loving what you do for your life?
Yeah, so one thing that's important to acknowledge here, I think in light of both your question and Anna's comments tonight, is just kind of, I would sort of say that, just echoing Aristotle, that we're social animals, most of us anyways. And so because of that, kind of, it's not just marriage and family, but it's also friendships and other forms of community. And so I've got a student at UVA is going to be doing, kind of a brief on what are some sources of happiness for people who are not married, kind of. But again, it's in this sort of like recognizing that sort of these communities, these friendships that we have, end up being really important for us, you know. And again, it's not necessarily things like money and career on that front. Other questions? Yes, Leah.
So this is essentially a question about how much we should expect historical returns to predict future ones. Indian arranged marriages are very successful, very amateur approach to marriage. You don't need to have met or know well the person you're marrying. But I think if we tried to marry off the DC intern class by a similar structure, we probably wouldn't succeed as well. Marriage often relies.
I suggested a mass Mooney wedding tonight.
It'd be a fun extension of
takers.
the Cato heritage
You
debates.
come to an
Right?
event called Get Married. You know,
You're walking out of there.
Yeah, the doors are locked. But my question is really that, you know, a lot of the historical data for the strength of marriage showed how strong it was for people who were able to enter an institution as amateurs, sustained by their church, their community, or their culture.
Sure.
Should we expect the returns to marriage to decline over time as marriage is more the union of two unrooted individuals and a tax code change?
That's a great question, but I think the surprising response to your question is, at least right now, we're seeing precisely the opposite. Right now, maybe it's because marriage is more selective, right? But we've got evidence from scholars at NYU. We've got evidence that I published with some colleagues. Mike is working on something on this too, but basically showing that for kids, for instance, we're seeing when it comes to school suspension, something that, you know, that Ian knows something about, when it comes to college graduation, when it comes to financial kind of instability, that the benefits of marriage for our children are actually increasing in recent years, they're not decreasing. I think that's probably because in a world that's more technologically distracted, in a world where there are fewer of these broader social supports to kind of help kids, in a world that's more economically unequal, I think having the benefit of stably married parents might be more valuable for our kids today than it was even, you know, 16 or 34 years ago, depending upon the data set. But on the adult side of that question, we also have evidence from the American Family Survey that the gap in satisfaction between unmarrieds and marrieds, it's not only is it just there, it's growing. With the unmarrieds becoming less satisfied. So I just wonder if, and certainly financially, we're seeing evidence too. John Iselin at Penn State. I've got something in the book with Wendy Wang showing that the kind of the returns to marriage for household income and for affluence more generally are bigger now for adults than they were back in 1970, the year that I was born. So I think that at least right now, the evidence is that actually it's not just that marriage matters, which I've been, you know, saying that for like 20 years now, but that it might be mattering more than ever for our kids. Certainly there's good evidence there, and maybe for adults as well. Yes, ma'am. Right here in the front, yeah.
Hi, I'm 26. I have a lot of girlfriends who are in their early 20s. It's hard to find guys to date us or to have serious relationships. It is situationships, casual dating, hookup culture, followed by a plan B run like the next morning. Like, that's what we have. So how do we get married, you need to get into a relationship. How do we encourage serious relationships and create incentives, maybe even in college, or communicate those things in high school?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think both you and Anna and I would sort of actually agree that this is one of the big challenges facing us, is that we don't have a healthy dating culture. We don't have, you know, kind of a world where people are kind of being sort of superintended, if you will, by broader cultural institutions and norms to kind of make good decisions that would facilitate, you know, marriage for young adults. And so I think maybe the next book should be kind of how to get married rather than to get married. But seriously, I think we need to be working on that issue. And so, but I have some ideas about this. So number one is kind of recognize the importance of people my age of being matchmakers, okay? So like, you know, reaching out to people, younger people in our networks who are looking to, you know, for a serious relationship or marriage, and putting them together. And having the people that we know, at least who are marriage-minded, be more intentional about kind of taking those first steps. So I have a graduate student at UVA, for instance, who kind of, you know, I know it's very marriage-minded, but I just wondered if he was like being intentional about asking people out on dates. And so I asked him about that, and he said, well, no, not really. I mean, he's very intentional about his education and his career, like he's on it, You know, he's got a plan for where he's going to go professionally. But there was like no plan for like, how are you going to go from being single to being married, right? There was no plan at all, right? So kind of having people like me encourage the folks who are at least more marriage-minded to actually be more intentional about taking those first steps and asking, you know, people in their orbit or asking friends to put them in touch with, you know, other folks. That's certainly one part of the response. But I think, too, another part of the challenge here is that because we don't really value marriage as much in the culture, a lot of our younger adults, including our younger men, are not actually kind of treating the people in their lives with a degree of sort of interest and respect, and are not really kind of looking to become more committed because marriage is not on their radar screen. So by not valuing marriage as a culture oftentimes, we're leading a lot of men and women, obviously too, in many cases too, to not kind of treat their partners or their potential dating partners with the requisite, you know, concern and attention. And then for like religious communities, I've seen it my own, in my own world at UVA, that the religious ministries that are serving UVA college students are now much more intentional about kind of hosting events, and not just hosting events, but kind of giving younger adults at UVA kind of formation about how to date, you know, the importance of commitment, the importance of not leading someone on, the importance of not using someone else for your own gratification. And so they're trying to create a culture that's much more friendly to like more constructive dating, and that's also going to, you know, lead to more marriages. And at least at my own parish, St. Thomas Aquinas at UVA, we're seeing an uptick in you know, younger marriages from students who've kind of come through that particular, you know. So that's one point of light, obviously, and there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of darkness here in this space. But I think if we're more intentional about trying to create a, you know, a newer culture that's more oriented towards commitment and also marriage in particular, and giving young adults some advice about how to navigate this new terrain, we can have some success in this space.
There's a great,
Yeah.
I was going to say, there's a great study out of Stanford that shows how heterosexual couples have met over time.
Right.
And the graph starts, you met through your family or your faith or maybe work, but all people who were connected to both of you, who had a sense of who you were and connected you deliberately. But over time, that has now completely shifted where that type of meeting one another is at the lowest, and the highest is all online means. So it's all transactional, people that don't know you, it's all based on superficial characteristics. So one thing, stay off social media data apps. Seriously, you're not meeting the kinds of, even arranged marriages were arranged by parents who, you know, knew there was some connection where I think that that's completely lost on the social media environment today.
I was just going to add, there was a BuzzFeed article that came out, I think in the summer of 2019, with the headline, Gen Z thinks sex positivity is overrated. And it was the most depressing article that I had read at that point in a very long time, although the world was about to get slightly more depressing, believe it or not. And it was about young women. It was about how young women are exhausted. One of the girls in the article was named specifically the show Girls. It was like she read Alienated America by Timothy Carney and just couldn't wait to tell a BuzzFeed reporter about it. But specifically mentioned how Girls and Sex and the City had sort of messed up her perception of sex. And obviously, I think the sort of, you know, it's weird for a social conservative to get up here and say, we really need people to start having more premarital sex. But the plateauing, actually it's not even a plateau, it's the decline in premarital sex rates, you know, it's coming at the same time as people are having very different ideas about marriages, are having a hard time dating, pornography is proliferating, and I think there has to be a revisitation of the conversation about the sort of grouping of marriage and sex together. And the other thing I'll say is just that point about how we conceive of marriage as something we do after we've completed the cycle of upward mobility, as opposed to the thing that can be an engine of upward mobility. That is, you know, a lot of my friends who went to great schools, live in New York City or Washington, D.C., they have a completely different perception. Especially from a lot of us with a faith-based background about what marriage is for. They wait, they save, and it's amazing. You know, some of these men make great sacrifices. They end up getting married, though, when they're 34, 35. Lyman is documented. That means they have fewer children than they end up actually wanting to have, which obviously affects happiness and fulfillment and civil society in different ways. So just the perception of what marriage is for has been skewed as well.
Let me just piggyback one point on that real quick, which is that attitude, of course, is also being communicated by their parents to them. So it's very easy for us to think, oh, these young people, they have bad ideas about marriage. Well, they're not getting them in a vacuum. It's also how we're raising young men and women.
So two things. One is, we'll get a question from Delana right here, and then the other thing I wanted to mention is that they're going to, or did you want to talk about what's happening afterwards, or?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so we're going to have drinks and treats outside in sort of the early Valentine's, Day spirit. So we'd encourage everyone to kind of just mix and mingle, and I would be overjoyed if this event led to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weddings in a few years. So
We can
please,
hold them here in this hall.
please mix and mingle after Delano's question.
Delana's question. Make it really romantic, Delana.
So one of the things I've thought about looking at the data around this is how the median age of first marriage has gone up from like 22 for women and 25 for men in 1980 to about 29 and 31 now. And it makes me think about not just the success sequence, but the success timing. And if those ages continue to go up, as Emily said, and you have let's say a man is married at 38, first child at 40, his son follows the same course, he becomes a first-time grandfather at 80 years old. Can you talk about how delays in marriage, and I think part of this is increases in cohabitation and people sort of approximating a married family without the commitment, how those changes will have societal impacts when we, for lack of a better term, cut out an entire generation because people are waiting so long?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's, we are certainly sort of seeing, this kind of delayed marriage is making it harder, number one, to have kids in the first place and have the kids you'd like to have in the second place. And it's going to make it more difficult for grandparents to kind of forge, vital life-giving relationships with their grandkids if these, sequences are so delayed. But it's just, I think, part and parcel of what we're going to, at least on current course, witness, which is just a lot less childbearing and, at some point kind of demographic decline, like we've already seen kind of playing out in Japan, and we're now seeing play out in South Korea, as we heard about tonight as well. So that's sort of the quick answer to your question. But on a more hopeful note, let's please enjoy the champagne out in the hallway, and we've got treats as well, and would encourage everyone to mix and mingle tonight. And thank you for coming out tonight. And in terms of